Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I am joined by Thomas and
Hello.
I am, of course, as always, Josh. And we thought we would have just a conversation about the philosophical direction that the West is going to go in. And the origin of this idea was simply that we had a conversation about this informally, off camera, and it seemed really interesting to me. And I thought that maybe we could extend it out into a full discussion. So this is not the usual kind of format where I'm kind of passing over some information. We're just going to be discussing, speculating about potential directions. But of course, Thomas is the man with the knowledge of philosophy more so than me. So I'm going to be the one that's going to be a bit of a naive questioner most of the time. I think...
Never accept the, shall we say, the infinite I'll stop talking now. Yeah.
Off to a good start.
Yes.
But no, we're thinking about talking about nihilism to begin with, and then we're going to talk about, I think you're going to talk about religion and how that feeds into it. We're going to talk about postmodernism. I'm going to talk about how previous kind of approaches to things such as modernism are kind of seeing a bit of a renaissance, if you will, and I'm going to briefly touch on morality, but we'll see how it goes. Haven't necessarily structured this in the same usual way, so it could be that we focus on some things far more than others. But to get right into it, what I thought to start with would be talking about nihilism, because it is perhaps the defining issue of our time in a way.
Yeah, there's a good case that can be made for that for sure.
And I think that we're living in the world where we're kind of at a point where we're living relatively comfortably, at least in the Western world, where we're kind of removed from hardships that are at least historic, not having enough food, high infant mortality, living until you're about 30, 40, and then dying. These sorts of problems that were intrinsic to humanity and inescapable, apparently in history. I mean, I wasn't there, but these things seem to, and overcoming these hardships seems to have given people in the past meaning. And this is something that we don't necessarily have anymore, because even if you're working a minimum wage job, you can at least get by. You're not, you may be regarded by the government as being in poverty, but the so-called poverty lines are drawn so that it's relative to a median, which means it's constantly moving. So someone in poverty could have a car, flat screen TV, have their own house. It's one of those things.
It's not really the poverty of old, is it?
No. Well, that's why the definition is so insidious, because it keeps on shifting, but the meaning colloquially is still more or less the same. It still means, not having enough to eat, not being able to provide for your family, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily to that extent anymore. I'm sure that still happens, but the kind of blame to lay on circumstance or the individual is certainly questionable there.
Yeah. Well, I think the way we understand poverty has changed dramatically as well, especially in the last 20 years. I mean, we used to understand it strictly in like economic terms. It was a matter of what you can and what you can't afford, and can you make enough, provide enough for your children, for your family to be able to survive. And being on the poverty line pretty much meant that you and your family were at risk of not being able to, shall we say, satisfy certain human needs. If you look at the political movements going on at the moment, it seems to like poverty is not just understood in economic terms. If anything, they're kind of bypassing this a little bit in looking to more forms of social deprivation.
Yeah, it's more about your social status now, isn't it? For sure. And I think this kind of absence of physical hardship is also compounded by the fact that modern society seems to separate us from our nature in ever increasing abstraction, in that you're kind of separated from the cause and effect of your own behaviour. And I think the growth of cities in particular has helped this, because people can behave however they want, perhaps outside of their own workplace, for example, and there's not necessarily going to be many social repercussions, because if they do something that's so egregious, they can just move to a different social group and then carry on behaving as they will. And there's almost like an infinite supply of people, and therefore there aren't the same social feedback mechanisms that would exist in smaller communities and therefore people can approach their life and continually make the same mistakes over and over without the same consequences to their person that might have otherwise existed otherwise. And this divorcement from cause and effect, I think, leads people to believe that there are no consequences to their actions, but these people, although they may disappear from your life, obviously still exist. And it's even if you are nice or horrible to someone you don't know, it still affects them, and it's almost a kind of narcissism that is washed over people, that they think that it doesn't matter that their actions affect others.
Yeah, well, I mean, even though cities are, of course, literally bigger than the villages that you've described, where there seems to be more, the community is kind of bound by sentimental attachments to people who you know and the objects around them, and that sort of thing. Cities all seem to make the world smaller in a weird way as well, because they bring lots of people with ends to meet for themselves together. And there doesn't seem to be anything kind of as much to lose from treating people as if they're like, I don't know, expendable. I mean, you could, like, if you meet someone in the pub, in a village just outside of Dartmouth, and your entire life has been kind of lived in that 10-mile radius, you're going to attach a lot more meaning to that conversation than if, I don't know, you're at a rooftop bar in London doing this every single week. Like you're probably not even going to remember that conversation.
I think that even conversations you have with people who you don't necessarily know, and you just happen to come across, I think they bear more meaning if you know that you might come across them again.
Yes.
And that's important, I think.
And that's probably why you never remember. In the case of, well, speaking to someone in the rooftop bar, you're going to be less inclined to want to remember their name with the background knowledge that you probably won't see them again in this kind of metropolis that surrounds you.
I think this is particularly pertinent for kind of contemplating what the future might hold, particularly for the West, because although, our populations are supposedly naturally declining at the minute, unfortunately, the growth is being propped up by immigration, which I don't necessarily agree with, but nevertheless, cities are still expanding, and I think there might be increasing urbanization, which may exacerbate the problem of meaning that you can get from being in a local community. And I mean, this doesn't necessarily have to be something that is inevitable. I mean, I grew up on the edge of a large city, and I felt like it had its own little pocket or community around, although it was technically a part of a major city, it still had its own individual local community that was somewhat separate from the whole. And these kind of isolated things can exist and be nourishing and very good for you in providing meaning. And it's not necessarily that there's something intrinsic about having a large city or it being dense or things like that. It's almost like the atmosphere or the ethos which people carry, because what made that area particularly special was that everyone made a deliberate effort to care for the people around them. And there were things like putting out stalls with things that they were selling. I think in the pandemic, they were putting books out that people could borrow, so that, they're not bored. Obviously, some of the bookshops were closed. You can still order stuff online, but it's not quite the same as, walking down your street, seeing, someone's got some books out, and it all worked on an honesty system and everything seems to have worked out fine. And in a nice community like that, it almost seems absurd to suggest, there's no meaning there or anything like that, because there's this exchange between people that you don't get in a more, I don't know what the word is, urbanized city environment, I suppose. I suppose this urbanization has been somewhat complicated by the kind of exodus from urban areas in the pandemic, because, of course, in the UK, you had people fleeing London because they didn't want to be in a city. And I think lots of places in the southwest, idyllic and rural, I think places in Devon and Cornwall, for example, the demand for housing went up exponentially because people realised that they didn't want to be in this urban environment. They actually wanted a bit more community. So it seems like even amongst people who live in cities, they have this desire, but it seems to go unfulfilled. I imagine it's a trade-off, isn't it, between economic
Yeah,
motivations.
what it means is that the aesthetics of cities on their own are not enough to keep people to those cities. You need a process underwriting its kind of instrumental appearance, its lifeless appearance. It's a self-perpetuating system, and when it stops, when the lever is pulled, I suppose that meaninglessness dawns on some people, and they think, well, is this all there is? Is this all I've been living? What, for the last 7 years? And of course, they start seeking natural beauty, if you like, which the countryside offers and which countryside communities tend to offer.
One thing that I do think is quite promising is that there's a certain amount of unity between the left and right when it comes to local environmentalism, in a way, in that people don't want to live around massive concrete blocks. They want to be around trees and nature, ideally. At least most people do.
Yeah.
And I think everyone has a kind of shared idea of what sort of aesthetic this might be. It might not be shared down to the exact details, but people want trees around, people want grass. They don't want it. They don't want lots of tall buildings squashed together, so the whole atmosphere of a place is claustrophobic. And that's something that, although I'm not as critical of places like London as perhaps other people that work here are, I quite enjoy visiting every now and then. But it's the difference from what I'm used to. I mean, I grew up in Devon, so used to countryside, open spaces and things like that. And going to a large city, it does feel claustrophobic after a while, but it's exciting to visit, I suppose.
And having lived in London for a year, it's exciting to be a part of when you actually feel like you're part of a process that's kind of bigger than you, and you have an active role within it. But it's you know that it's if you don't keep up, it's going to keep going. You don't want to be left behind. It has some coercive force over what you do, the way you live your life, and that there is almost like an added sense of satisfaction from that. It's a group dynamic pleasure principle that can be dangerous, of course. But when that stops, I think you really see, I suppose, the vulgarity of modernity for what it actually is, especially in certain parts of London. Not so much the West, but certainly the new developed gentrified areas, I would say.
One of the things that struck me the most, I think, and this is probably just because I grew up in quite a sparse area, I suppose, is just how dense it is. I've been in like Leicester Square on a weekend evening, and you're almost shoulder to shoulder no matter where you are. And that in some ways is very dehumanizing. You don't necessarily feel like an individual. You don't feel like you're necessarily I don't want to say special, because that's a horrible way of putting it, but
you feel insignificant.
Yes, exactly. You just feel like another number on a spreadsheet, or and I don't think that's necessarily healthy. I think it goes too far in the opposite direction of things like ego and narcissism. I think they're problems that are pretty prevalent in our society already, but at the same time, you don't want to feel like you contribute nothing, or you're so insignificant that it's meaningless. And I think that there's a certain element of that just through people's environment, which being in a tight urban environment with lots of people pushes them towards. And I think that it's either going to go two ways in a way. People are either going to realise that this is really unhealthy and want to de-urbanize and kind of spread out a little bit, or it's going to go more towards they're going to embrace this almost and say, okay, well, things are not very significant, and be more collectivistic, I suppose. And we can kind of see that in a way in places like China, where they've always had a very large population. They're more inclined to collectivism even pre communist revolution, and it's one of those things where it's kind of concerning, because it's the major economic centres of a country a lot of the time, and I don't know where it's going to go. Ideally, we would want to see things spread out a bit. It might not be economically as efficient, but people will be more willing to make trade-offs with their economy and their environment and the people they socialise with, I imagine. But to go back to what I was originally meant to be talking about, it's modern life is very separate from what human beings have traditionally done. We more or less, our time was occupied with activities tied to either getting food or reproducing and quite often dealing with conflicts that arose when there's competition over the two. But these are, if you had to boil things down to the main priorities, I don't think these have necessarily changed, but they've become far more abstracted from the direct goals.
Yeah, there are divisions of labour present in, I suppose, the world that we've inherited that weren't present back then. As in, back in, I suppose, ancient times, we literally hunted whatever we ate. There was almost like a non-conceptual relationship between the things that we consumed, whereas now we know second to nothing about the things that we enjoy or what even gives rise to their value. We're withdrawn from that. And I think one effect of modern life that's not being discussed enough is how that's having an effect on everything else and our relationships with each other. I think it's having more of an effect than people realise.
I definitely think it is, because I've seen, just to revert back to the food scenario, I mean, getting something in a packet, it's almost like optimizing the separation in a way, because you see perhaps native cultures and kind of hunter-gatherer societies, once they hunt an animal, they almost venerate it in a way. And there are cultures that used to perhaps say a prayer once they have killed an animal, and they have rites and rituals to treat it with respect and things like that. Whereas now we don't treat what we eat with respect or acknowledge that the animal has suffered to do so. And I sound like I'm going to start turning vegetarian, but I'm not.
Well, I'm not exaggerating, but in some cases we don't even know the animal that we're consuming. If we're giving dishonest information about what that thing is. I mean, I'm sure the majority of you are aware of the horse meat scandal. I mean, this is the full expression of that fact.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.